Hi everyone on Facebook, Steve Barrett here from PRWeek. We are ready to do our weekly podcast. We've got a great guest with us this week, Aedhmar Hynes from Tex 100. How you doing, Aedhmar?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm pretty good actually, yeah.
Good.
I am. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Trying to get you on the podcast for a while and pleased that you can make it. And we got Frank Washkuch, our news editor. How you doing, Frank?
Good to be here as always.
Yeah, well it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Franktastic Frank, as we've started calling you in the newsroom.
You can only live up to so much. Steve.
Yeah, Franktastic. You actually put that in a headline today.
I did not, actually.
That was someone else.
Not that I would give away the secret sauce to how our headlines are made.
Well, we should say, as we're going to talk about AI later, that we still produce them ourselves, don't we? We don't get an algorithm to do that. So yeah, we're going to chat to Aedhmar and talk about a few things. Busy week in PR, so let's get going.
Great. Not to be totally frank. That's not yours.
I got two of those. Anyway. I'm not trying to do the Kellyanne thing here.
Frank's gone on Kellyanne on it. So was it In Excess or was it Bob Dylan?
It was, I saw it.
Or was it Love Actually?
I'm not going to lie to you, I saw it last night after 10 o'clock. I saw people tweeting about her holding this, and
I didn't believe it.
I thought I hallucinated the whole thing.
Oh
I thought
my God, I was exactly the same.
And then I woke up and I saw so much on it, and I was like, what?
All right, well, let's get into the podcast. That's a little bonus there for the Facebook Livers. Hello and welcome to the PR Week, PRWeek's regular weekly roundup of everything that matters in the worlds of PR and communications. My name is Steve Barrett. I'm the editor-in-chief of PRWeek, going to guide you gently through the next 20-25 minutes with our fantastic guest this week, Aedhmar Hynes, who's Global CEO of Tex 100. How you doing, Aedhmar?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm very well. Yeah, we're really pleased to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Good friend of PRWeek, and we always like to hear what you have to say, and looking forward to chatting to you. And we have Frank Washkuch here. He's our news editor, Franktastic Frank, as we've dubbed him, and he's just been experimenting with the Kellyanne Conway use of signage to pass messages. How are you doing, Frank?
Not as effective as she was, of
course. But
I don't expect to be a meme.
But Franktastic in its own way.
I can only hope.
Yes, indeed. So we're going to talk to Aedhmar. We'll talk about the PRWeek Power List, which was released last week. Much anticipated, and a good year for the Irish, as we will pick up on. We'll talk about Bell Pottinger in South Africa and Weber Shandwick in Egypt, and interesting developments with those accounts this week, and we'll lead that into a discussion about where the line is on what you should work on and what you shouldn't. We'll talk about net neutrality, and we're going to make it interesting. Aedhmar promises to help us do that. And we'll talk about IBM hiring Mike Mendenhall, interesting hire there, and we'll lead that into a discussion on AI and anything else that grabs our attention over the next few minutes. So, Aedhmar, welcome to the show. How long have you been in the States? Because we're talking about the Irish thing. You've been here running Tex 100 for quite a while.
Yeah, I actually moved in '97 from London. I had been based in London, and I moved out to San Francisco originally. To set up our operations in Silicon Valley, and from there I moved to New York in about 2004. So I'm actually longer out of Ireland now than I was in Ireland, which is one of those things that for us non-Americans is a measure of how much time.
Is that a tipping point? I've got a few years to go before I hit that.
I think it is a tipping point. I think the biggest tipping point is the point at which you determine that you're going to bring your children up in a different culture, and so that came a few years ago for me. But yeah, no, I'm really enjoying my time here. So no plans to return.
And have your kids got Irish or American accents?
Well, 2 of my children were born in London and 2 were born in San Francisco, so I'm afraid there's no Irish there at all, other than anything that they might pick up from me, which is just subtle nuances on the language.
Yeah. So tell us about Tex 100. Part of the Next 15 group which is an interesting holding company, lots of technology related agencies historically, and done a bunch of acquisitions actually, 2 this week. So tell us about Tex 100 and your place within the group and how the group's sort of evolving.
Well, what's interesting about Text 100 within the group is that we were the first agency, if you like, in that when the company was set up some 35 years ago, it was named Text 100, and only later, after we went public on the London Stock Exchange, was the name changed to Next 15, in order to give Text 100 as a subsidiary its own definition and its own infrastructure, if you like, in order to develop that brand independent of the group. And over a period of time, obviously, the group has moved on to make further acquisitions, and Text 100 has stayed squarely focused on the technology industry. I would say, you know, in the last 5 years, the development of the business has been away from purely public relations, like most agencies, and really moved more squarely into integrated communications, marketing communications. And for us, that has required us to do our own number of acquisitions in order to bring in new skills and talent into the organization that, frankly, we were challenged to hire one by one, because I think to bring in creatives and developers and people with skills that aren't typically aligned with a PR agency, it really does require you to kickstart it by making acquisitions of small teams of people who can help you to navigate what is in effect a pretty different field.
Yeah, and how has tech PR changed? Because you know, the Valley sort of started with, you know, the HPs, the Microsofts, and the companies that are now really establishment, aren't they? And the IBMs to a certain extent. And then you've gone through different phases with the Facebook, Google generation, and then the next generation with Snapchat, etc. Are there threads, common themes that go through communications and marketing? And what have the biggest changes been?
Well, I think for me, you know, what we have moved from in terms of Text 100 has been working squarely in technology as just an industry, whereas now technology is part of every industry. So for many years when I was leading the organization, I remember we would sit as a management team thinking, how do we diversify our portfolio of clients? Because one of the challenges you have is when you're in one sector, you hit up against competitive issues in terms of being able to expand your business and work with competitors. So that was always a topic of conversation, but we really believed that we needed to stay true to the core of the business, which is that we understand technology better than most. And that was definitely a differentiator when we went up against the more generalist agencies. But in the recent past, the beauty of the way technology has evolved is that we're finding ourselves now in a position to work across many different industries, whether that's finance, healthcare, you know, automotive, airline industries, because today technology is disrupting all industries.
Sure.
And so there's definitely a role for an agency that understands technology deeply and is in a position to help many companies that are perhaps not technology companies at their core, but are using technology innovation in order to differentiate themselves in the marketplace. So today we find ourselves working with many companies that are looking for you know, a strong specialization and an understanding of technology and where it might not just disrupt their industry, but help them to disrupt themselves.
How big's the cultural divide between the comms sector on the West Coast and over here on the East? Because I spent a few months in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, and it's very different over there, isn't it? And niche agencies can thrive over there, and maybe in a way that sometimes they can't in New York, and then maybe Next 15 has prospered through that by having Outcast and Byte and Text 100 and a lot of other brands.
Yeah, it's interesting. I you know, while I would completely agree that West Coast versus East Coast is very different culturally, you know, I'd actually argue that there's probably more similarities, certainly in the technology industry and the communications departments across the world than perhaps within other industries. When you go into highly regulated industries such as pharma or oil and gas or those kind of industries, you see far greater differences than you do in communications and technology firms. Just simply because, you know, if I look at how communications is in London versus India versus the East Coast, West Coast, you start to see a lot of similarities, because the one thing that's the common thread with technology companies is speed and speed of innovation. And so we find ourselves constantly needing to work at a 24/7 speed in order to be able to communicate effectively with all stakeholders in an industry that's moving at such a fast pace. And I don't think all industries are the same. So for me, I think there's more commonalities east, west, and across the world within tech than there perhaps is. I would draw a bigger comparison in other industries.
Yeah, and you've actually expanded a lot in places like Asia. What's the secret to doing that when you're not an Aedhmar or a Weber, an $800 million gorilla, but you've got certain scale and you've managed to expand effectively into those regions? What's the secret behind doing that effectively?
The secret for us has been culture. You know, the development of our business has been organic largely in entering into new markets. And so and I'm a good example of this as somebody who came to San Francisco out of our London office. We found that if we transplanted one of our own Text 100 people into a new market, their job was to build and replicate not just the firm in terms of the products and services we offered, but actually the culture and the values that are core. And when you have somebody that holds that as the key element of the kind of people that they hire, then their job is, one, to find the best of breed local people who understand the local cultural and differences. But if they share your same values, then actually you're going to find that becomes a common thread for the business. And so for us, you know, what's remarkable, and I didn't truly believe it when I became CEO, but when I moved from Text 100 office to office, is you meet the same kind of people who are motivated by the same sort of things. And so that's an important element of what I think has made the company successful, and that's why we have people who stay for a long time at Text 100. We probably beat a lot of the trends in terms of
especially in Asia, I would imagine.
Yeah, everywhere actually. We have a great track record of keeping people because of the focus we have on individuals, on developing their career, and we make a big point of being, you know, very much agnostic towards gender or differences in people. It's very much an equal opportunity organization, and people who are, I think if you're excited about technology and the role that it's playing in the world, and you're excited about communications and the power of what we do, then that's a key ingredient to be successful.
Finally, on that topic, I mean, there's been a lot of publicity recently about sexism on the West Coast and in Silicon Valley, you know, with Uber and other companies. A culture really that seems really old-fashioned actually when you think about it, but it clearly still exists and still a big problem. As a woman working in tech and having worked over there and having worked here, what's your take on all that, and how do we change it? How do we change that culture? And is it as bad as we actually think?
Well, I think that it only takes, you know, one rotten apple to have an impact on an entire industry. And while my entire career has been in the technology industry, I haven't personally experienced anything like some of the stories that are coming out of Silicon Valley. I think what makes me proud today is that women are coming forward and being a lot more vocal about things that perhaps were acceptable 10 years ago. So for that reason, I think it's important that we pay close attention to it. But, you know, fundamentally, I think it comes down to leadership. I think the values and cultures of our company come from the top. And I think if you've got a flawed character at the top, it can create a flawed culture within an organization. And it doesn't really matter who you bring in to try and change that. Cultures are hard to change. I mean, it's hard when something is endemic in an entire organization. That's not to say it can't be, but I think there's some real fundamental challenges where companies are going to have to dig really deep and think about, you know, why has this occurred and what is it that we're going to do about it. And for me, it goes beyond just having quotas and, you know, having policies in place. It really has to come into the fabric of the organization, that people live it and believe in it, as opposed to something that, well, we can put a tick in the box because here's the platitudes that we're placing or the emphasis that we're placing on this. It goes far deeper than that, which for me is why I sometimes try and deviate away from the notion of female leadership and talk more about leadership. What are the qualities of leadership? Because there are tremendous qualities in both men and women. It's just a matter of making sure that those are the qualities that are amplified at the top of the company, and they have to be about people and getting great value from people.
For sure. And that takes us nicely onto our Power List. Actually, the PRWeek Power List released last week actually had a woman at number 1 for the first time on her own, Karen Van Bergen of Omnicom PR Group. We had Katie Cotton on there with Steve Jobs one year, which was but Karen's the first woman to be number 1 on the list. So congratulations to her. You're on the list.
I am.
Congratulations to you.
Thank
you. But you did point out an interesting factor, which I hadn't really thought about. 3 Irish people out of 50.
Right.
And you're outnumbering the Brits, because there's only 2 Brits, Matt Neal from Golding and Alex Thompson from REI.
I was tongue-in-cheek when I made that comment, but I should have known that the British would come rolling back in to try and beat that statistic, but I'm glad to say that the Irish have beaten the British on this occasion.
But this actually made the papers in Ireland, didn't it? The Sunday Independent did a little piece on...
It did a little piece. I think, what was interesting for me was not necessarily, other than to jibe you, which obviously was...
Well, that's always worth a bit of sport, isn't it? I like to play a valuable role in people's lives.
Absolutely. No, I think what I thought was interesting, besides the fact that for such a small country that you have 3 people represented on
and the other 2 just took John Saunders at Fleischmann Hillard and Declan Kelly at Teneo.
Yeah, and what's interesting, what was possibly more interesting, was just also the fact that we actually have taken a very different path to where we are today. Obviously John has been an incredibly successful communications person in his own right in Dublin, and his firm was acquired, and then he ultimately got to the top as CEO of Fleischmann Hillard. And then I think Declan has taken more of an entrepreneurial route and has been incredibly successful at building a number of different businesses, and today as the leader of Teneo is taking communications and consulting in a whole new direction. So, and obviously my own history is different in that I've stayed a very long time with one firm. So, I think probably as you reflect on the entire 50, you'll probably find that's not uncommon that we all got to where we got to with different paths, but I think those 3 individuals are a good representation of Ireland.
Sure. Very much so, and all 3 principally now sort of based in the US, I guess.
Absolutely.
So interesting. Frank, anything else that struck you about the Power List?
Well, obviously the big deal was Karen Van Bergen being on the top spot, and she has really moved up the charts in the past couple of years, from when she was CEO of Porter to now this big umbrella group role that she has. So interesting to see if she'll repeat next year, because she has oversight of how many different firms. So you could say she'll be tough to knock out of the top spot.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it changed. I mean, this industry changes very quickly in 12 months. That's why Cannes an interesting snapshot, because you do kind of measure, the trends by what you're hearing there. But we definitely put some different people in this year, people to represent the video content film area, the tech area, the consultancies that are coming into the business, Accenture and IBM iX.
From Huge.
And Dale Bornstein from M Booth, which is an X15 company.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're trying to represent the whole industry and the changing industry. There's no point having the same 50 people there every year, and hopefully we stimulate a bit of conversation doing that. I think we did this year, judging by some of the emails I got, but anyway, that's another story. All right, Frank, let's talk about some of the big stories of the week. Bell Pottinger in a bit of
crazy
mire down in South Africa, and then Weber Shandwick, a bit of controversy about their Egypt contract.
So the Bell Pottinger story is really, it's a wild story, and that they fired a partner and apologized over some of the work they were doing for a South African client. And what they were accused of more specifically was stoking racial tensions in South Africa, which obviously is a very sensitive topic in that country. So they dismissed partner Victoria
Gagan, I would imagine.
And suspended 3 staffers over what are called inappropriate and offensive activity for a former client in South Africa, and that is Oak Bay Investments, which is a conglomerate that is run by the Gupta family, which is closely linked to the country's president, Jacob Zuma. So it stopped working with the client after a 13-month relationship. It became a political football, became a big social media issue in South Africa. And it's also set off this sort of sparring match between the current leadership of Bell Pottinger and the co-founder and former leader, Lord
Tim Bell.
Yes.
Tim Bell, yeah.
Lord Bell, excuse me.
Lord Tim Bell,
Who
as in
is,
the Bell in Bell Pottinger. Yeah.
Right. Who has criticized the current leadership, saying
James
they essentially
Henderson, yeah.
did not listen to him. Called it a smelly.
Yeah,
network,
it's
yeah.
provided great copy for PR Week UK, that's
It
for
has.
sure. But yeah, I don't know if you could comment on the specifics of this, Aedhmar, but some of the issues with that one is, should the CEO be expected to know what's going on in every subsidiary around the world? And then they were saying that they were misrepresented, that the situation was misrepresented to them, so that's why they got rid of the executives there. But shouldn't the CEO really know what's going on, especially with very sensitive contracts like that?
Well, it's hard for me to comment on this
Sure,
specific
sure.
case,
So
but if I think about it in Text 100 terms, you know, I would say it's difficult to know everything that's going on in the organization. However, you have to rely on the leadership to make sure that anything that has any sensitivity or could impact the brand in any way is elevated, and that there is a mechanism in place, even if somebody doesn't think that's important, that there's a mechanism in place to make sure that it does come to light. And so the way our structure works and the way my leadership team works is that we have somebody who represents all of our business in Asia, and you know, part of my regular dialogue with that individual is not focused on financial well-being of the business, is actually focused on the client work we're doing. So it would be inevitable from my perspective that something that had any element of controversy about it would land on my desk. So.
You talked a bit about culture before. I mean, it's hard to believe that in 2017, an international big firm like Bell Pottinger would do this in South Africa without somebody stepping up and saying, look, this is a way too sensitive of a
Which is what
going
Lord
here.
Bell claims to have done.
Right, but claims he's ignored.
But it's a bit of a tit for tat there,
Sure.
yeah. And then the other one was Weber Shandwick in Egypt.
Right. Weber started working for the Egyptian government, and we should say more specifically they were reporting to the intelligence service in Egypt, and they
The
were
Egyptian version of the CIA, is that a good analogy there?
But those are your words and not
Okay,
mine.
fair enough. And the Atlantic's words, I believe.
If
They did a piece about it on Saturday.
If I hear a knock at the door later. So they were working alongside with their former subsidiary, Cassidy and Associates. There's a lot of moving parts to this story. So last month, Cassidy and Associates bought back the agency from Interpublic Group, so no longer a subsidiary of Weber.
Right.
Interesting timing, Frank.
Interesting timing. And this Sunday, there was a critical feature in The Atlantic about Weber's contract, more specifically, and how this big multinational PR firm was handling all of this work to influence U.S. public policy on behalf of Egypt in the U.S. So this week, Weber has reevaluated all of its contracts for foreign governments that are trying to influence U.S. policy. Now, we should make that point because it's not just foreign governments in general. You know, it's just the ones that are trying to influence U.S. policy, and they are stepping away from the work for Egypt. Cassidy is sticking with their contract. So, again, lots happening here, but as Cassidy has stepped away from Weber and Interpublic, they're hanging on to the work for Egypt.
Yeah, interesting story. Slightly surprised they took that work in the first place, to be honest, but that they did, and now they've taken the decision to give it up, and Cassidy's no longer part of Weber, and it's no longer part of IPG, so they are standing by their decision to work with Egypt, who they call an ally of the United States.
Right.
So
I mean, there's two ways to look at it. I mean, you could say, yes, Egypt's an ally, and you know, American firms should work with a country like that. On the other hand, you could say, wait a minute, this is a country that's essentially run by a military junta, you know, so
yeah.
You know, there's two ways to look at it.
Aedhmar, for the wider point here is, where do you draw the line in the type of work that you agree to do? Everybody's looking for new business these days, and it's very competitive out there. but I guess you must have a line in the sand where you say, we're not going to go after that sort of business or that particular client. How do you approach that at Tex 100?
I think largely, well, the kind of sensitivities that you're referring to there aren't typically what we would find from a technology point of view, but what we typically will do is we put it out to our team. If there is in any way something that people do not feel comfortable with, then they are given the opportunity to voice that. And so for us, there's both my obligation as the CEO of the company to make sure that anything that we do is both appropriate, legal, and and fulfills the focus on doing something that's fact and trustworthy. But there's also the mechanism of making sure that our people feel comfortable. I mean, the best example I can give is at one point being asked to do some work on behalf of a tobacco company,
right.
And they were using innovation and technology in an interesting way. But people didn't feel comfortable about that. But I think where it comes into play within my organization is cultural differences, perhaps religious differences, background, that perhaps there are areas, and that's sort of our litmus test. We'll walk away from something regardless of value if people in any way have a problem with it. But for the most part, if you go back to the technology piece, we just don't come across this.
You're lucky, I guess, in your field, aren't you?
That being said, I remember one of our earliest pieces of work was with Microsoft when they went into South Africa, and part of what we did.
Still during apartheid, or?
It was still during apartheid,
right.
and their need for a trusted partner at that time was to help them navigate what was a complex political and cultural situation. And so, in that era, it was as much to do with staying out of that as it was to get involved in the political side of things. But it's interesting. I think these things crop up all over the place. We've had situations in India where there's been issues of representing something to do with Tibet versus China, and where do we sit on that piece? And so it comes down to people.
For sure.
And where they are.
So you doubted our ability to talk for 25 to 30 minutes, Aedhmar, and we're already at 25 minutes. So I'm going to make an executive decision to drop the subject of net neutrality.
Oh,
I know there'll be thousands of disappointed viewers out there. And we're going to go on to IBM, a long-standing client of Tex 100.
Absolutely.
You and Ketchum have worked with them for many years. IBM Watson, which is the sort of artificial intelligence arm of IBM, has hired Mike Mendenhall, well known in the tech space, comms space. Tell us a bit about that, Frank.
Yes, he is of course a veteran of HP and Disney before that, sort of a marketing celebrity, if you will, a well-known name. So he is going to be Chief Communications and CMO for the Watson division and cloud platform, which I think maybe a lot of people don't know also includes Weather Channel, the weather company now.
Is David Kenny runs that, does he?
That's
Yes.
right.
He came with the Weather Channel, he's former publicist.
Right. And Mendenhall is going to report up to him.
Directly to them.
Interesting guy, David.
So yeah, it's the next move for him. He has been at Flex for the past couple of years. He was at Fusion.io for a few years before that, before the acquisition by SanDisk, and I think probably best known for his HP work years before that.
For sure.
Yeah.
Interesting times there. Aedhmar, IBM, what's it been like working with them for so many years? A business has gone such a transformation and continues to, and this is the latest transformation. AI was at the talk of Cannes a few weeks ago. Everyone's chatting about how it's going to change the business. What's it been like working with IBM, and what's the Watson division bringing to the mix?
Well, I think I speak on behalf of not just myself, but a whole team of people at Tex 100 across the world who have felt very privileged to have the opportunity to work with a company like IBM that is innovating and transforming the world in the way that IBM has. I think the other thing that's been particularly important has been John Iwata himself, and the fact that we have had the opportunity to work through the era of e-business, on-demand computing, Smarter Planet, and now U to the power of IBM. In communications terms and marketing terms, case study platforms for communications and marketing. And IBM stands at the forefront of you know, being an innovator, not just in terms of the company itself, but in communications. And so for us, it's the opportunity to work side by side with that team has been just extraordinary, and an extraordinary part of what we value at Sexism.
And how is AI going to affect PR? We've seen it really might disrupt media agencies, you know, because that's a lot of numbers, a lot of crunching data, but there's a lot of data in PR now as well. So how's it going to change the industry?
Well, I was at an AI conference at the MIT Media Lab earlier this week, and one thing that is very clear is that AI is everywhere. You can't opt in or out of AI, and actually defining AI as anything is almost impossible to do. It's having, you know, it's going to have an impact on our legal structure, on healthcare, and as well as communications. And so Text 100, we've taken the route of exploring AI in terms of how we run our own business. We really like to see how we can take the power of the data that already exists within the organization. So we use a lot of technology, both in terms of employee and HR, across our finance infrastructure, IT, and across the work we do on behalf of our clients. And so what we're excited about and what we're exploring is, if you take that data through the open APIs, are we in a position to innovate, to look at how the data interacts with each other, and what insights can we take from that? Because if you think about it, if you have insights on our people, and you combine that with the performance or financial performance of the business or IT, you begin not to just understand what's happened in the past, but the potential to begin to anticipate what's going to happen in the future. And that's where the real magic is. And yeah. I won't say we've cracked it, but it's something that we have a team of people focusing a lot of attention on, which is, you know, can we as a company, as an agency, be more powerful ourselves and be more progressive in how we use technology. And so, you know, we don't want to just serve the technology industry. We want to be a technology innovative company ourselves. And, you know, I'd like to think that we as an agency could have the potential to disrupt our own industry.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really worth looking out for across the board, isn't it? Next couple of years. In fact, Publicis with Marcel is a tool for them to work across their 80,000 people, you know, that they're investing in. So they're going down a similar road.
And they're going down a very specific dimension of it. I think we're fortunate in that we're not as large as Publicis is, and so they're going down very much the people route, whereas we have implemented some tools in order to be able to get feedback from our people literally on a daily and weekly basis. And so we can test the temperature of how our people are feeling and cross-reference it to other countries across the world. That's just one piece of it. If you do something similar in all other aspects of the business, and you combine it, and you use machine learning or you know, any form of machine intelligence technology, then I think we're going to begin to take what is the essence of human plus technology and come up with something very powerful.
Yeah, looking forward to following that. So thanks for joining us. The Sunday Independent was not wrong. You have the gift of the gab. And it's been great chatting to you over the last half hour. Frank, always a pleasure. Don't forget our Diversity Awards. You've got next week is the final deadline to get your submissions in for that. So please do contribute to that. Very important cause we're working on with the PR Council. But that's all we got time for. This is the end of this week's show. We'll see you next time on the PR Week.